Hi, everybody. I'll give you a moment to connect to sound here. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1318th New Social Environment. I'm Joshua, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Esteban Cabeza de Baca and Gaby Collins-Fernandez. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Working primarily in painting, Esteban Cabeza de Vaca approaches his work with the aim of bringing awareness to marginalized people and places. The landscapes he depicts are painted from nature, infused with layers of memory and time. Employing a broad range of painterly techniques, Cabeza de Vaca entwines layers of graffiti, observational painting, and pre-Columbian imagery to confound Cartesian single-point perspective. The artist's hybrid techniques and influences form a complex braid, interrogating the dialectical relationships between colonialism and its critique, between cultural extraction and its inversion. Our host today, Collins-Fernandez, is an artist living and working in New York City. She holds degrees from Dartmouth College and the Yale School of Art. Her work has been shown in the US and internationally, including at Peter Freeman, the Birmingham Museum of Art, and El Museo del Barrio. She's a founder and publisher of the annual magazine Precog and a co-director of the artist-run art and music initiative Bomb Pop-Up. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Gabby.
Hi, everyone. Welcome again. Thank you for the amazing introduction. And it's really such a pleasure to get to talk with Esteban about his show, Pollinators. And the first thing I wanted to ask you, so before we even get into the idea of pollination, the show, as you can see it here, constitutes medium, and small scale paintings, as well as bronze sculpture. Um, And a part of in Joshua's introduction, one of the predominant visual characteristics of the work has to do with this visual superimposition of contrasting visual fields inside of this space of landscape. And, I think it's a really important and interesting starting point to open up a conversation about your work, about how it takes on the various histories of landscape and its observation. And of course, the way that landscape painting, certainly in like the United States of America, but in different places as well, has been linked with ideas about ideological conquest, the Hudson River School, um, and how, right, ideological conquest and sort of ideas about the country and how it sees itself, and how it sees the landscape as an image of its own destiny and ideology. Um, and I think it's really interesting, that it's been such a continuous and pervasive characteristic of your work that you both present the landscape as grand and also constantly interrupted. And the linkage of that kind of juxtaposition with breaking historical narratives is really clear, I think, both conceptually and visually. And I just wanted to ask how you came to this strategy and also how you're thinking about landscape.
Yeah. Thank you, Gabby. Can everybody hear me okay? Am I coming in clear? Cool. Yeah, thank you guys. Thank you, Gabby, and thank you to the Brooklyn Rail. This is really exciting to get to talk about the show. Yeah, I feel like some of like the ways that I came to this process were, going through school, going through the Bauhaus School at Cooper Union and being drenched in the abstract expressionist school, but also interdisciplinarily being educated through like sculpture and painting, and at some points just wanting to learn how to become like a technical savvy painter in realism, and I was taught by mostly conceptual artists that were more interested in Marxism. So I kind of taught myself painting in one form or another through observational painting, going outdoors and being educated by nature. But then inevitably I was taught from, middle school age at Denver School of the Arts how to do bronzing, how to do ceramics, and actually learning how to do like Pompeo style ceramics. And so for me, it's like trying to understand how to technically paint actually kind of helped me drift more towards like being possessed by the land and letting that kind of guide me to actually rediscover more of who I am and my family story in the Southwest of being mixed heritage, part indigenous, and then part Spanish to the Southwest. And like my mom's family is from Mexico, and I grew up along the U.S.-Mexico border in San Diego and San Isidro. And so going back and forth between Tijuana and San Diego was just like a big visual inspiration. But then my father's family is from New Mexico. So, this mixture of indigenous people with Spanish people in New Mexico. So I have like this connective conversation between different communities. And I just think of like the strategies of like how to kind of hold certain things, how to challenge people that are comfortable, and how to comfort the people that have been challenged historically. To kind of think about that Paul Tech quote, and how art can kind of do that in certain ways and build relationships and stuff like that through art making. But yeah,
I mean, I think one of the things, even hearing you talk about it, which is so interesting, and especially like when looking at the paintings, is that like the way that you construct this kind of like these superimposed landscapes, right? Often when we look at one of your works, there's kind of a larger, more like recognizable, visible kind of landscape, observational landscape. And then one or two other sort of like superimpositions or interjections, which fracture the landscape either with a different kind of picture or with like a sense of the non-visible world, right? And so I think it's also really interesting that one of the ways that like one of the techniques that you use to um, talk about these histories and also offer like an alternative relationship to the land is to use painting to kind of question the implications of like projecting into visible space, right? And like how do you visualize feelings or connectedness to the landscape that are not an immediate or identifiable part of that visual world, right? So often there are nets in your work. There are like, I think places that you've talked about as portals in the past. And so treating the landscape as both an image which is fractured and a space which has the potential to open up into kind of unexpected spaces seems like it's really connected to the kind of spatial strategy that you use in your work. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that experience of space, and sort of like maybe if there's like a difference in your work between like the space of the visible and the space of painting and like the space of like touching feeling with the land.
yeah. So I think, going to Cooper Union and being, drenched and kind of indoctrinated in some beneficial ways with like the New York School of Abstract Expressionism was something that I really craved. I loved Philip Guston, and I also was inspired by how much he spent time in Mexico learning from the Mexican muralists and like almost building glyph-like substructures in his paintings towards representation was something that I wanted to know more about. But then, reading that de Kooning book and just, in 2000s, like really being inspired by that I romantic idea. But I think when I got to school, I studied with like Dana Schutz and Bobby Bordeaux and Jason Fox, and I think they were really trying to get me to be less illustrative with my work and be more direct, like how a gesture and movement of your body can say so much more about subject matter than trying to represent it representationally. So, I think in tandem with me going outdoors and painting on site, but also like layering and superimposing these different histories that have kind of been like nullified because of the colonial project of reworlding in the design of European conception of seeing, the new world as like a terra nullius, nothing's there, so let's build, but completely not seeing the grounded ecological knowledge structures that aren't so much bound in like technology from like a mechanistic way, but like how indigenous societies thought more of like grounded ecologies. So I think for me, building up that language kind of started out where how can I not illustrate it, but actually like be it, encompass it, move through it with like dyeing from natural pigments from the Southwest, but then also like being out with my like motherland in the Southwest. But how can that relate to the histories of the New York school? And I think, there's that book, How the New York art world stole the art world or something like that, and it basically talked about how the New York abstractionists were like a product the of the FBI and how they were used as a way to kind of steal the left wing energy and put it into the marketplace of capitalism and stuff like that. So in some ways, I've said this before in other talks, but I like to use the language of abstraction and abstract expressionism to like inoculate me from like the plague of modernism so that I can kind of like critique, but also show how influenced they were by indigenous ways of making, whether it's Philip Guston or even like Jackson Pollock, where he'd use like get inspired by the sand paintings of Navajo sand painters to work on the ground. So that's sort of like that inkling of superimpositions that I'm really excited about, and how to not illustrate something, but to also not be afraid to like also use all those skills of character building as well too. So I don't know if that answers your question, Gabby, but
No, I think listen, I feel like it's actually, it's really fascinating because like your paintings are really like visually compelling and seductive, right? Like the color is really like warm and draws you in, right? And there's this kind of like unsettling relationship between the things that we immediately recognize and the ways that we're like kind of thrown off kilter. And so it's really helpful, not just helpful, but I think really like an interesting kind of like historicized position to take on, right? To think about like using abex as a kind of like inoculation or vaccine um against like being used by neoliberalism or something like this, right? Feels both like an interesting proposition and also like kind of hard to pull off, right? It's like the idea also, as you were talking about abex as well, I was like, something that I think gets over, like something that I think gets sort of covered over by the justly critical position that we have toward modernism now is the fact that like so many of those painters were like weird radical freaks, you know what I mean? Who like of their
mm,
own accord were like looking to criticize authoritarian government structures and capitalism, right? Like half of them were also involved in like various kinds of labor organizing at the time that they were working. And so I think that like the history of abstract expressionism that you just positioned is almost like a cautionary tale. Like, don't believe too much that any aesthetic that you develop could on its own be liberatory without being coupled with other kinds of historical strategies and like tools toward developing agency, which I think I know that's a little bit of an aside, but I think that, this connects like quite obviously with like your family history and your mother's relationship to organizing, like labor organizing in her own life, right? So this being a part of your upbringing. But then on the other hand, I think that there's like something going on in terms of the figures in your work, both this is a great example, figure watching television. But the way that you use figures in the paintings, and also often the way that you use sculpture, which is to create agents, right? More obviously in the sculpture because they end up becoming integrated in landscapes, like living sculptures to the degree that you're literally growing stuff on them, and they're often outside and intended to, participate in a kind of ecological system. But there also seems to be this kind of like question about like the relationship between art and agency that I think you're presenting, especially in your use of figures in the paintings and in the sculptures, which I think maybe complicates this question about like the historical co-optation of aesthetic styles, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and how like sculpture can enact the ideas in the paintings and have like a cross-pollination of ideas where, in like a Giacometti kind of way, like how can it extend the ideas out into the viewer's three-dimensional interactive picture plane is something that I'm excited about, and that it's not just like inactive objects that are, reliquaries in a museum context, but it's like things I'm actively teaching my students with of like how to think about, how we come together as artists and in community with one another, but then how is like the agrarian movements historically been forms of resistance, of storytelling, of singing. And I think especially right now, like just ways at which people have overcome genocide, and found ways to keep telling cool stories that are just so irresistible, even to the colonizer. How can we tell stories that are just thrilling, but also like not seeking adventure, but more enlightenment or knowledge and stuff like that. So I think for me, I when I went to school sometimes at Cooper, there were some teachers that were like, this is too illustrative, this isn't painting. But then, when I look at Piero della Francesca or something like that, sometimes some of those paintings are so character driven and they look like cartoons in certain ways. But then what I also really appreciate is how Abex people like Philip Guston like built in and took these characters so then they could talk about things like the KKK discrimination and how people have been able to, I don't know, like survive and ideate about futures. At least that's where I take it for this show of just thinking about like speculative futures of forms that could kind of resist, but also like be resilient and keep us going. So, anyways.
Could you talk a little bit about some of the archetypes? I know that you're really interested in different Mesoamerican archetypal traditions, and I'm wondering if you could like talk about the figures because they're also like extremely powerful figures. So if you could talk about some of those archetypes that you're interested in and how you see them playing a role in the work.
Yeah, there was a show, Lives of the Gods, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I used to be like an art handler there, and like right out of undergrad in 2010. And on my breaks, I would go down into like the Mesoamerican section, which was kind of part of the African section and stuff like that. And I would just draw there during lunch breaks, and for since I've moved to New York, the Met has been a place that I've just loved to go to. It's kind of like my church away from, whatever, away from home. And so they had the show, The Lives of the Gods, a couple of years ago, and I got to go with my friend Brian Leahy and Catalina Ospina. And Catalina was showing me a lot of like these different figures and explaining all of like the interesting histories of Mesoamerica to me in ways. But there was this one figure that I saw, these little flute figures that I thought were really awesome, and they're just like these, smaller than I'm representing them. High-pitched flutes that have survived for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so I've just thought, if these little things could survive this long, but then also kind of be a way to, connect either sonically in an interactive way with people to think about rituals of corn and when the seasons and plantings according to like the Mayan calendar, when that would be. And that painting, I think it's called Tzolk'in, which is Mayan for calendar. Just thinking about time, different structures of time, but how actually very similarly the time structures are around the 360-day cycle, but there's a long count and all of this interesting ideas that I'm starting to think through. But I also got really into Ana Mendieta's work lately and thinking about how, as an exile from Cuba, how she was able to stage some of her performances or just connect with like her motherland through going to ancient sites in Mexico. And so for me, it's like, how do I kind of like break down the different layers, but to kind of show a resilience through layers of and connectivity in a time when there's just so much struggle, especially in the Southwest for like water and I don't know. There's just a lot uh, with that. So
I mean, we've been talking, I know there's like there really is a lot to talk about in your work, and I think, like one of the best parts about spending time with your paintings is that they do open up into all of these conversations, both, like about the present, about the past and the future. Something that you've been talking about now, and I know is like of great significance to you, has to do with this kind of relationship between like it's almost like a resilient the resilient forms of the past, right? How to make the past something which we can carry with us. Um, and also how to speculate into the future. Like what does it mean to imagine a future that like isn't horrific? You know what I mean? That's better than like what we're dealing with in the present with all of the various challenges that we have. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about like sci-fi in your work, like the idea of science fiction and like it's almost like an archaic science fiction too. Like I keep thinking about the painting of the figure looking at the television, as though it's like, like Narcissus looking into his own reflection or something like this. Um, and like yeah, like this kind of almost dated version of sci-fi and its relationship to a kind of like speculative, more functional future. What do you think of
yeah,
that?
I, yeah. I mean, I consistently teach staying with the trouble to my students on Donna Haraway and how, she talks about how feminist ecological thinking uh, in the archive only goes back so far because of, how people would say this isn't, scientific enough. It's not physics bound enough. So like, she kind of laces in her theory, but connects it with speculative fiction. So even though it might feel as though it is fictive, it's also philosophical and like, but she's also interested in like Richard Hyland and like Octavia Butler. And for me, I'm also like, how can I kind of like in the exhibition, this TV is probably the most technological piece in a normative status quo kind of way. But I also think that there's technologies with growing from like the Three Sister plants that is highly sophisticated and able to like re-nurture depleted ecosystems and how what can a future look like that's not bound in traditional notions of technology, but more older forms of technology. Um, and so, yeah, I'm interested in how you could speculate about the future and also like showing different portals in some of the paintings where it's like maybe through our free will as human beings, we're able to make different decisions on the futures we want. Where maybe one pathway is optimistic, maybe one pathway is in between, maybe another pathway is, post-apocalyptic, but to show that, we have free will, and even though it might not seem like we have power, I think collectively we do have power to make changes, and to just not let ourselves become brainwashed with apathy has been something that I return to these figures of just something that's hopeful and resonant.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's something that seems really like the parts of your work which are the most hopeful, I think, connect to like the persistence of care, right? Like how specific kinds of objects in history have in fact um persisted, right? And then also like m potently the power of the imagination, right? And how it is that painting can participate in like encouraging us to like have an imagination about the future, right? That may not be quote unquote, again, scare quotes, realistic, right? That may not map onto like the contours of the visible world or what we might expect in the visible world. That in fact, like there's a really powerful element to making art which involves presenting the non-visible or things that are somewhat like unbelievable as things that we can internalize, not as like fictitious, but as like teaching us how to understand what possibility might look like. Which is why I think, for example, this painting is a great example of, this kind of combination of abstract space, protest movement in front of some, like law enforcement type figures, right? And the idea of the past, kind of like figurines from the past, Mesoamerican kind of cosmology as like a way of imagining a future, which doesn't map onto the contours of the present. Um, and I'm
Yeah.
wondering if, yeah, if you could talk a little bit about like the imagination for you.
Yeah, I something that I do off and on is like keeping a dream journal. Just remembering my dreams because it's hard to remember my dreams, but it's also a great way for me to kind of just self-analyze myself. So I do have like kind of like a practice of just like keeping my own dream journals to conjure out my power of like imagination and subjectivity. But also like hearing my parents' story of occupying spaces peacefully and just holding ground. But like, I'm going to explore this in other works later on down the road, but how my dad specifically was able to create Chicano Park in San Diego when they were trying to create a cop station to kind of surveil the barrio by just telling the barrio that they're going to build, and trespass. And so everybody occupied that area and started planting plants and, celebrating and just holding and occupying. So I think that painting that we were just talking about too, it's like, how do you just form ways inspired by, the Cesar Chavez farm workers movement that he was inspired by Gandhi? How can you use nonviolence and organizing to really show how evil and corrupt the powers that be are? And a book that I've been reading recently, this book by Joseph Pierce, Speculative Relations, kind of talks about how recognizing kin, whether it's in the land or with somebody completely different from you, or even just your surroundings, can help awaken ourselves just to memories that have been lost through
Mm.
colonization. And just and we people keep throwing that word colonization around, but like, how do we actually see ourselves in the land and in other materials, even art materials too. Like this is from cochinilla from Mexico, and just how you can kind of recognize the sacrifice that bugs place from like cactuses that are grown, and just all of like these interrelationships rather than seeing things as unconnected is something that I hope the work does.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, to your point, Esto, like a word like colonization becomes something that we can like hear and have a feeling about, right? Without actually knowing all of the various ways that it has exerted not just like literal domination, but also like ideological domination, right? Like trade implications, right? So, we haven't talked, I mean, maybe this is a way to kind of bridge into some conversations about materials in your work, right? But like the development and extraction of cochineal from the Americas was like a colonial trade imposition where all of a sudden like Europeans came to Mexico and South Central and South America, and we're like, oh wow, like this red that we don't have from a stone, like we can sort of like basically fa not farm but collect, extract the color, drive this population of insects, like close to extinction, right, in order to like get this like desirable thing, which is color, right? Which is
Mhm.
intrinsically now tied to the history of painting, right? So like the idea that like that's part of the effect of colonization, and also the idea of like Cartesian spatial organization and our understanding of a painting as reflecting a scene from one place, right? And also like our understanding of how to depict reality and move forward like teleologically throughout history, right? That like and I'm just sort of like riffing on what you're saying, right? But that like when we talk about the colonial, like it sounds like it's just one thing, which is like the name of the occupying force of a specific place. But in fact, it's like a series of operations that is so interwoven and so complicated that it's actually quite hard to break apart, right? Which is, I think, one reason why it's so important that in your work, um, the idea of image and rupture and fragmentation is actually quite woven, right? That you have
Mhm.
all of these different ideas and layers, materially, pictorially, in terms of like symbolism that are visible and incomplete, right? As though they too have gone through
Mhm.
the processes, some of the processes that we've just described. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I was gonna say no. That's really thank you for saying that too, because I don't know. I've just been thinking about specifically with the show, like how people think about land, and land use, and to think, this isn't just an issue for people that are indigenous to the U.S., but that, after the Civil War, Black Americans were promised 40 acres and a mule, and they were never given that, And I think the colonial project is very uh, nimble at finding ways to extract value, find ways to alienate people from landed epistemologies and extract as much as they can. And like for me, I'm always thinking in some ways, how can painting think about land back to indigenous people? How can we kind of imagine what that future could look like if we were to give land back and to not be so reliant on data centers that are extracting water to help our AI searches or just cool down data centers that don't really need to exist. And in some ways, I'm thinking about like what the future of water could look like in the Southwest and along the Colorado River in more equitable ways, but just water also in general, but also land. So I don't know. That's just what you were making me think about, Gabby.
I mean, I think that's another reason why like thinking about your sculptures and like the idea that in painting you're kind of like proposing all of these conditions and giving us the tools for understanding some of these different like ways of thinking about like the history of painting, the history of visualizing landscape. I mean, not to, like put too fine a point on these things, right? I'm sort of summarizing, but that it gives us like a code for understanding how entwined we are with these systems and what some options might be to kind of like release ourselves from them, even in our minds, all the
Yeah.
while like we're looking at this like sumptuous, beautiful thing. But your sculptures actually kind of take on a sort of different project. And I think that they become actors. And I know that we sort of talked about agents a little bit earlier, but like they become actors or they become something that like gets returned to the landscape in a particular, in a kind of more direct way. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the way that you're thinking about the sculptural work, both in the show. I mean, here it's in the middle of the space, but quite often, actually, your work is installed outside, both at the Momentary in Arkansas, up at Wave Hill a couple of years ago. And if you could talk a little bit about like sculpture as like a collaborator with the landscape almost.
Yeah. I don't know. When I was a kid growing up, going to museums, I would love to touch things, and just have that tactile sensation and interaction. And I think, also that idea of farming, whether it's like indigenous farming techniques that I mentioned before of like the Three Sisters, but also like knowing about native plants, but also like, Black farmers' history in the United States and just all of like these uh, old practices of farming and working with the land has just been something, a technology that I've been interested in, just learning more from an amateurist notion. So I teach at SUNY Purchase and they have like a native plant garden there. So some of these uh, pieces are direct burnouts from some of like the mulch pile there of things that were just thrown out, but to also like teach my students native how to plant, native plants like echinacea, milkweed that help pollinators, along their pathway. But also, and there's also in some of these sculptures little bees that are in there as well too. So just thinking how it could be a relative way of thinking, but also how these can go outdoors and people can touch on, and like the oils from people's hands can oxidate the metal and change the patina too. That it's not just an idea that's just relegated to an alienated existence, but that people can actually interact with. And I love the work of Felix Gonzalez Torres too, where and some of his work, he like the giveaway of things. And I like that idea that art can be disseminatable and extend past the life of an exhibition too. So I don't know, that's something where I just like the idea of interactive art and site specificity, that it's not just an airdropped in piece, but it's like there's sunflowers from the area, there's native plants from the area. So anyways, I could go on about plants and stuff like that, but it's that's where I get a lot of my ideas from.
It's such a great it's really nice to think about Felix Gonzalez Torres in relationship to your work because like first of all it's not like an obvious association, you know. But second of all, I think that thinking about like both gifts and candy, right, in this way, is a nice or sweetness, right? The idea that part of an aesthetic experience, even when it's about difficult things and like trauma and death, can include the taste of sweetness on the mouth, right? So like pleasure, um, communion, you know what I mean? Like being with one another in a way that feels good. Um,
Hmm.
and then second of all, that like the idea of especially in the work that we're talking about, with I can't remember immediately, I forget the name of I think it's just the name of his lover, right? The candy piece. Anyway,
Hmm.
um, but in that situation, right, the gift of the art which gets disseminated into the world, right, also has this element of a kind of hopeful, speculative in futuring. That's not a real word, but like making sort of like a gesture toward the future, which I think is really interesting to think about in relationship to the idea of pollination in your show, right? The show is called Pollinators. Um, and like, you know, the idea of bees or other pollinators picking up sweet things from one place that they use to eat and then carrying them to another in a way that is both connected to like fertility and bounty and like the growth, new growth in the world. Um, but also, you know, relates to a kind of idea about like hybridizing the present which exists, which like with the possibility of like unexpected futures, is a really nice, it's a really nice idea. Like I was thinking just now that like if your sculptures are literal pollinators, then like the paintings become like metaphorical pollinators that give us all of these ideas that we then take back into our lives.
Yeah, that's really nice. I mean, it's also like I like the idea that these outdoor sculptures could be hosts for plants to grow through them, and that's sort of like future ideas of different projects that I love, that, it doesn't have to be the traditional notion of a monument outdoors that people, you can't touch it, or it's just also on a pedestal away from the earth, but that I'm interested in how sculpture can be porous and things can grow through it, and just the pouring of water and soil, touching bronze can change it in really beautiful ways. But I think also the concept for the show too, I was like, what would the future look like, in the year 2025? How much things would change, how many things would remain the same? And I think consistently, I was like, if the future was given and the land was given back in some ways, or maybe there was some environmental catastrophe of just collapse, then there's just going to be more of a reliance on older knowledge structures that are grounded in ways of knowing and growing, for time immemorial in the Southwest. So then, I've seen like a lot of science fiction movies. There's one foundation based on Isaac Asimov's book that was on Apple TV that I enjoyed in some ways. But I I in the show I was like just thinking about what would kind of exist in 500 years from now, but also looking at Cloud Atlas and the way that they kind of modeled the future in that science fiction rendition of just being like people are very degraded in a way, but then there's people from other timelines or other places that come in and help out in another way too. But I don't know. I was just trying to think about like people being able to have the special superpower that they could make portals on command and help people escape and jump towards safety or towards salvation or not salvation, but just, safer harbor in a way. So
Yeah, it makes me think about like how from the position of science fiction, it allows you to see the present as a ruin of itself, which is in some ways really appealing considering how rough things are right now. Maybe always, right? Not just right now, but yeah, I'm thinking about, could you talk a little bit more about like how you're thinking about painting in portals?
yeah. Um, I think, to go back to abstract expressionists too, I love Joan Mitchell and the way that she just builds out emotional landscapes of remembrances and whatnot, and like the way that she just builds out color blocks, but also like strongy, vulnerable gestures between and through those like patches or little garden sections within her paintings was something, or as soon as I saw those paintings, I was like, I'm gonna steal that idea to like build out portals of like scenes from things I actually saw. There's that one Aspen Eyes painting that I employed these kind of techniques on, where it's sort of like I made this painting from observation out in Aspen when we were teaching at Anderson Ranch, me and Heidi. And I was like looking at Mount Daly there and just painting it from observation. And I like looked to my right and there was like a golf course of people just playing golf. And I was like, this looks great. This is crazy. It's really, really crazy. And that's, in this very beautiful place that we're just so in contradiction to it. And then I looked to like my left and there was like these aspen trees just like
Mm.
there and they just have like these eyes that I just feel like they're looking at me and I was like in a very hippy dippy way being like just give us more time. I know you are probably angry at us humans, but I'm just like just give us more time and hopefully we can like redeem ourselves or something like that. So in that way of thinking about abstract expressionism and portals and not illustrating that the honest gesture that Joan Mitchell and her work conjures. I was thinking about how I could kind of resonate that in this piece, but also show the different free-willed possibilities of humanity, either going towards like this accelerationist bad move or something in between, and then possible hopeful futures too. But yeah, interlacing the gestures too, where like the first layer that you read pictorially immediate is like the first layer I put down of masking. And then I let that dry, and then I paint over the whole thing with like gesso, and then I start like another layer. So it's like four landscape paintings in one.
Yeah.
And it's also like another thing from like the New York School of this like Jack Whitten, where he talks about trying to develop the developer of just making something very instantaneous and quick. It's just been something where it's like I want the honesty of the gesture and for it to not feel contrived, but to also be a site specific and connected to a very particular issue, whether it's like water usage along the Colorado River and speculating about what that could be in the future, but
Right.
also thinking about its relationship to like the border, and the politics around water and the border.
Well, it's also, I think, like it's notable, especially in the terms of this conversation, that you're like you can't actually see you have it's like you kind of have to believe that the painting is going to turn out, because you're like working on it in these stages where everything is masked like four different times. And I know
Yeah,
that you can like
sometimes it could
adjust.
be a complete disaster.
Yeah, like you can probably adjust like after each layer, but like there is a certain element where it's like I was thinking about how in your work the thing that we read as gesture is actually quite mediated because it's an area of masking, right? And so what because
Yes.
like the quote unquote honest gesture is not necessarily like the brush mark. It's the section of image, right? It's the idea of image as a kind of gesture or like ideology as a kind of gesture. It's a little bit more like heady than maybe a Joan Mitchell like than that paradigm, right? Where she's just like this touch and this touch and this touch and this touch. But I also, especially as you were talking about this question of the Colorado River drying up, like in this case, it takes a while to understand, for example, that like in some of your work, like in this painting, you stop making the image like at the point where something critical or dangerous might be happening, right? And that's the place where it drops into materiality or like into imagination. As though like, at the bottom of these look sort of like the Vermilion Cliffs or something like this, right? Like at the bottom of
Mm.
the landscape where there might have been a river, which is now being kind of like, destroyed by our like climate, our contributions to climate disaster, like what you get instead is the material of the land, right? It's like because you're using cochineal and indigo as the base of the canvas, it's like when image gives way, it gives way to effects that come from rocks and bugs that are themselves return us to the land.
Yeah. That's really nice. Thank you, Gabby. I mean, I also think, like three-fourths of the border with US and Mexico is covered with walls. And,
Yeah.
if we continue, there will be like less porousness for pollinators to go through, whether it's bugs or like plants or even like jaguars and animals that are indigenous to that stretch of the land. It's just like it's not good even from an ecological point of view to just have a completely impenetrable border either. Things need to breathe and also the river needs to flow, and I think if we were just to manage the Colorado River better, there wouldn't be blight. I think that there's like crazy data centers or just like huge agro business that's just sucking up so much water that just doesn't need to be that way. And I think I'm hopeful about the future, maybe naively so, but I do think that maybe it's not art's role to tell people what to do, but just to get people to think about certain things like this.
Well, I mean, I think there's also, and again, like this painting that we were just looking at, about the lunar passage is interesting. Like kind of an interesting way of thinking about this idea, right? It's like, we might see the edge as a portal or a frame, but it could also be a hole in a wall, right? And then there's this other kind of like doorway that's set at an angle that either depicts or contains people moving through it, right? And like the ecological implications of like setting up a wall, like a literal wall to keep people out are like significant, right? And simultaneously, like the idea that as humans, we actually pollinate ideas with one another, right? And that actually the US has been like ideologically isolated from many of like the resistance and revolutionary struggles of Central and South America precisely because of the kinds of like mental contortions that we make to like separate and racialize difference between these places, which is also like backed up by political ideology as well, right? But that like, it's like what you get when you build a wall, right? What you prevent from moving is everything, right? It's the water, it's the people, it's the plants, it's the animals, it's the ideas, it's the creativity, right? And so like it's an interesting, I think in this painting in particular, like the idea that you turned the door into the portal, right? Or the painting into the door into the portal, I think asks us to like imagine what the surface of the painting could be as a place to kind of like act out these ideas, maybe a little bit in a way that's a little bit more complicated than we're used to doing.
Yeah, I mean, in Western science and whatnot, like the experiment happens in a safe lab or like a contained, clean environment in a way. And I think in so much of our ways of thinking, we segment in order to concentrate and experiment or think through isolation of a problem in order to then think about ways at which it could be instrumentalized. But I think maybe there could be a more ecological, connective way to think about how problems and solutions could be navigated rather than just to build walls and to think about things in that way, but to maybe reflect and think about the way nature grows and operates as not to think about like usurping of power, but more like how things relate and get cross-pollinative power from one another, you know? So I just think about that, but then to also link it to the ideas of like art history and like the ideas of like purity in color and I remember like going through art school and talking about like reading, like pure color. And to me, that doesn't make sense to me. I feel like color comes from somewhere. It comes from the earth. It's extracted, mined, mineralized, and sold to us. So it's not really that pure, you know. I mean, I think they meant it in another way, but for me, it's like can so many things are in relationship to one another, and that you could say it's purified and refined and whatnot, but it's like I'm just thinking about what's the cost of that, and to
Sure.
just show how things are so like interrelated in a way too.
So one thing that you've brought up a couple of times, but I want to make sure that we have a little bit of room to talk about before questions, is the importance of collaboration in your practice. I think, we've talked in some ways about like the sculptures as having this collaborative element with the landscape. I think your teaching and pedagogy is also quite collaborative, like when you, especially as you talk about your students and how you're teaching them to think about the integration of art and landscape or art and ecology and impact. And you also have like a couple of long-term collaborations, probably most predominantly with your partner and fellow painter Heidi Howard. And I'm wondering if you could just talk about how you think about collaborations, why you pursue them in your practice, and like how you started doing them.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I grew up around, union organizers that were like, constantly collaborating and thinking about how to build and organize like people to like progressive ends. So, I met Heidi. Heidi's an amazing painter, installation, sculpture, and portraits. And just to see the way that Heidi relates and interacts with people when they're sitting has been something that's been really inspiring for me. And so, we're 24/7 talking about art and dialoguing with one another, but also sharing, you know, resources, but also ideas. And she grew up, with parents that were in new music, but also collaborating in the sound arts world, sculpture and installation, and also thinking about site specificity. So that was just, something that I just think about a lot with my work of just how it's not just based in, making beautiful objects, but this quote by like John Cage, less like an object and more like the weather, like how can you make something that just feels like it's like going through us and connecting all of us too. And yeah, so that's really inspiring. And Heidi has actually like a reading tonight at Printed Matter 6 to 8 with like a Susan B as well too. So definitely go check that out. Speaking about bees and pollinators, go check out Susan B and Heidi Howard's thing at Print Matter tonight at 6 to 8. But yeah, it's just good just to bounce ideas off of each other and to think and not just be individuated as an artist.
Thanks, Esto. I mean, I think that's a really sort of delivering us back to the group, right? To the communal elements of art, like how we kind of like as artists, we focus the energy kind of alone sometimes in the studio, and ideally it gets like distributed back into the collective. I think is a really lovely place to end the formal part of this conversation. So thank you, everyone. And I think we can turn it over for questions. And thank you, Esto, for being so honest and so earnest in your work.
Thank you, Gabby. You're amazing.
Thank you both so much, Gabby and Esteban, for that wonderful conversation. We're now going to turn to our audience Q&A. If you do have a question for Esteban, there's a link in the chat where you can submit. But we have a couple here that I'm going to kick us off with. The first one comes from Nicole, who's curious about the book that you mentioned, Esteban, about the government involvement with ABEX intentions.
Yeah, I think it's called How New York Stole the Art World. I'll look it up and put it into the chat. But it came out probably like 20 years ago.
Thank you for that. While you're grabbing that, the next question that we have comes from Aaron, who asks, "Do you foresee your art proceeding toward more overtly political presentations?"
No, I would just like it to be. I mean, I don't know. This past summer, I went. Who's that one artist, South American artist? Ligia Clark. She had a show, in Berlin that I saw this past summer, and she's making really cool like paintings and sculpture with metal and just so sophisticated. And then she got into performance, and then she like eventually just stopped making art and just helped out people, and I don't know. I don't know if I'd become like that, but it's definitely enticing sometimes just to see how much sometimes people just need help. So I just think more of just like how what organizing or community efforts are already kind of going on and how it could just help. And maybe that's through art making or just hanging out or whatever. But I still love painting. And there's like that one quote by Joan Mitchell where she was just so depressed sometimes and she'd be like, I don't want to paint anymore. And then she'd say, like, oh, maybe I'll just paint a little bit today. And I think about that sometimes, how painting just makes me happy, even when things are looking really rough outside. But yeah, hopefully just still painting.
Thanks so much for that question, Aaron, and thank you for that response, Esteban. The next question comes from the audience who's curious about the interrelatedness between the show Pollinators and your teaching practice, and how you see those as connected.
Yeah, I think I start out from the point of view of like with my students of observational painting, where I'm just, showing them all the techniques I use when I go outdoors, or even just, on campus somewhere close by for my students that, how to kind of think wherever you go, you don't leave anything behind and you leave it cleaner than when you went there, and hopefully better. It's sort of like my mentality when I take students outdoors to paint, or even when they're, painting a model, and to really like see and find like ways of seeing, or like their own like that Albers quote, like how to see, teaching them how to see, and not just to later on regurgitate reality, but to find something behind reality that's there, and to kind of bring that to the forefront out of subjectivity has been something that I find really fun. And just to see that art and painting doesn't just have to be in object making. It could be like a relational aesthetic, and coming out of like a ecological way of relating to your surroundings. So I don't know, that's sort of the way that I like to teach. That's just the beginning, and it could become expansive depending on my students' point of view and their interests.
Thank you so much for that response, Esteban. And our last question before we close out our program today, actually is a question that I have for you. And it's about your material choice. I noticed in a lot of the paintings, there's in some, there's the use of soil. Indigo is used in quite a few of them as well. But then there's also some more processed materials like spray paint and acrylic paint. And I'm just curious about how you landed on this particular mix of materials in your paintings.
Mm. Yeah, I think I'm constantly trying to find things that I get excited about. And I did like graffiti growing up, and then when I got to Cooper. I didn't want to lose my scholarship by getting caught doing graffiti in New York, so I stopped doing that. Um, but there's just always like this glitch that is interesting when you're doing spray paint of just like this drop shadow, or just also the speed and the way that you're able to index the movement of the body, of activating the whole space. That's just really exciting. So I think there's just some moments in the show where I'm just trying to show deeper space, but maybe something that feels more digital, or just something that's also really connected, in ancient Mesoamerican and Native American rock art. They would use their hand as a stencil and then just put pigment in their mouth and then spray out of the mouth. So, the cave paintings are also like a way, like the ancient studio onto themselves, but it's also like people trying to have a conversation with ancient ancestors in the land as well too. So it's not so much for some paintings, some of the cave art. So I just think about that, of just like the ancient qualities of spray, and how I like to think about it with people like Basquiat and other people today that are working. So yeah,
Thanks so much for that. And that concludes our audience Q&A today. So I'm going to throw the virtual mic back over to you, Esteban, for a reading today.
cool, cool. I found this artist statement by Ana Mendieta from before she passed away that I really like, that I go back to. So I'm just going to read this quick artist statement. And thank you guys so much. Thank you to the Rail. Thank you to Fong. The Rail is such an amazing resource, especially right now when media is under threat. This is like a great resource for people to hear about all the different disciplines of art. And thank you so much, Gabby, as well too. But yeah, here we go. Um, My art is grounded in the belief of one universal energy which runs through everything, from insect to man, from man to spectra, from spectra to plant, from plant to galaxy. My works are the irrigation veins of this universal fluid. Through them, I ascend to the ancestral sac, the original beliefs, the primordial accumulations, the unconscious thoughts that animate the world. There is no original past to redeem. There is the void, the orphanhood, the unbaptized earth of the beginning. The time from within the earth looks back upon us. There is above all the search for origin.
Thank you for that, Esteban. What a wonderful way to close us out. Thank you again, Gabby and Esteban, for this wonderful conversation this afternoon. Thank you, Caroline from Garth Greenan, for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Marion Bolton Kippy Stroud Foundation and Tiger Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making these weekday conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 25 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're available, join us next Tuesday at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Tom Burr and Craig June Lee on the event of their concurrent exhibitions in New York, Journal Works at Bortolami Gallery, and I Want to Love with No Fear at Chapter New York. And as is real tradition, we now invite you to turn on your microphone and say hello and goodbye as you leave today. Thanks so much for coming out.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you, Esteban and Gabby.
Thank you.
Gabby.
Amazing talk.
Thank you.
That was so wonderful. Thank
That's
you.
great.
Thanks so much again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.